My family called me a failure while my sister lived in their penthouse. On her graduation day, a stranger passed her an envelope. It was a 24-hour notice to leave. I am their new landlord. That text right there. That is exactly what happened on a real Saturday afternoon in Nashville, Tennessee, at a graduation party where my family was celebrating my sister with champagne and catered food and matching outfits, and the specific performance of success that my family had spent 20 years perfecting. In the middle of all of it, in the middle of the toasts, and the photographs and my mother crying happy tears about her golden child finally getting her degree, a man in a plain gray shirt walked through the crowd, found my sister standing near the balcony with a glass in her hand, and handed her an envelope. She laughed when she took it. She thought it was a card. Maybe cash inside, folded neatly, because that was the kind of people who came to our family's parties. People who understood that our family spoke in the language of money above everything else. She opened it. She stopped laughing. The room was still doing what the room was doing. Music playing, conversations going, my mother laughing at something my aunt said, my father with his arm around a business associate, the posture of a man who owned the space he stood in. My sister read the letter once. Then she read it again. Her face was doing something I had never seen it do before, which was lose every single layer of its performance simultaneously. The confidence, the ease, the particular way she held herself in rooms where she knew she was the most important person. All of it left her face at once, and what was underneath it was something I recognized because I had worn it for years. Disbelief. The specific disbelief of someone who just found out the ground they were standing on was never actually theirs. The letter was a 24-hour vacate notice. The penthouse apartment that my parents had been paying for since my sister graduated high school. The apartment in a building in the Gulch neighborhood of Nashville. The building with the rooftop terrace and the concierge and the heated parking garage and the monthly rent that was higher than most people's salaries. That building had a new owner. The new owner had decided not to renew the existing tenant agreements on certain units. The new owner had sent legal notice to all affected tenants. My sister was an affected tenant, and the new owner's name at the bottom of the notice was mine. Here is the question worth sitting with before this story goes anywhere. How long does it take for a family to forget that the person they wrote off is still watching? How many years can you call someone a failure before they stop listening and start building in silence? In my case, the answer to both of those questions was the same number: 11 years. 11 years of being the wrong child, the failed one, the one who didn't take the right path or produce the right results in the timeline my parents had decided was the only acceptable timeline. 11 years of watching my sister be handed everything while I was told to figure it out on my own. 11 years of building something real while my family looked the other way. And then one Saturday in Nashville, while they were celebrating without me, the building they had been living in sent a letter with my name on it. Smash that like button right now because this story earns every minute of your time. Subscribe to this channel if you're new. Every story here goes this deep. Ring that notification bell and let's go all the way back to the beginning. To a house in Brentwood, Tennessee. To two daughters who grew up under the same roof and were treated like they lived in completely different worlds. My name is Rachel Torres, and I am 33 years old. I grew up in a 4-bedroom house in Brentwood, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Nashville where the houses were large and the lawns were maintained, and the cars in the driveways communicated the specific aspirational version of success that Brentwood families worked very hard to project. We were close enough to real wealth that the distance was embarrassing to my parents, and they managed that embarrassment by making sure everything visible looked exactly right at all times. My father, Marco Torres, was a commercial real estate broker. A broker, not a developer. The distinction mattered to him in ways he tried not to show and showed constantly anyway. He made a good living. He worked alongside developers and investors who had significantly more capital than he did, which he understood as a temporary situation that had somehow lasted 20 years, and he addressed it primarily by making sure everyone around him understood how well connected he was rather than how much he personally owned. He wore good suits. He drove a leased Mercedes that he traded in every 3 years on schedule. He knew every restaurant host in Nashville by name, and they knew him, and that relationship mattered to him more than most people would admit out loud. My mother, Sandra Torres, was what Brentwood called a community pillar, which was the specific category occupied by women who had the time and the organizational skills to run school fundraisers and neighborhood association events and charity galas, and who used that visibility to maintain a social position that was slightly better than their actual financial position warranted. She was warm in public and strategic in private, and she rarely examined whether those two things were in conflict, because examining things that worked was not something she had ever found necessary. They had 2 daughters. My sister Vanessa was born 3 years after me, in 1994, and from her very first years it was obvious to everyone in the family, including me, that Vanessa was the one the story was going to be about. She was beautiful in the immediate, attention-capturing way that made strangers comment on it in grocery stores. She was socially brilliant in the way that some people were socially brilliant, which meant she understood rooms before she entered them and knew exactly what version of herself to present to any given audience. She made adults feel charmed, and she made children feel included, and she made my parents feel like they had done something right just by producing her. My parents loved me. I want to be honest about that because this story could go in a direction where they were monsters, and they were not. They loved me in the way that parents loved the child who required less managing, adequately, genuinely, but without the specific fuel that came from pride. My father was proud of Vanessa in the loud, chest-forward way that fathers were proud of children who confirmed everything they hoped to be confirmed. He was proud of me in the quieter, background way that communicated affection without attention. The difference became most visible when school started mattering. Vanessa was not a strong academic student. She was smart, genuinely smart, but in the social, intuitive way rather than the classroom way, and she had discovered early that being charming was a more reliable strategy than studying, and had made a practical decision to lean into the strategy that worked. She passed her classes. She graduated. She did what was required and not much more, and her teachers liked her anyway because she was warm and present and easy to have in a room. My grades were different. I was not the kind of student who found school easy. I was the kind who found it interesting, which was a different thing entirely. I struggled with the parts that required memorization and excelled at the parts that required understanding patterns and systems. My math teacher in 8th grade told my parents I had a genuine gift for structural thinking, which was a phrase that landed in our household approximately the way a compliment about someone's good handwriting landed, appreciated, filed, and never mentioned again. By high school, the pattern had established itself so completely that nobody questioned it. Vanessa was the social daughter, the visible one, the one my parents brought to professional events because she worked rooms the way my father wished he could. I was the quiet one, the one who read too much and said too little, and who my mother gently suggested might want to smile more at parties. When it came time for college decisions, my parents paid for Vanessa's application to 4 private universities without discussing the cost. When I got into a state business program on a partial academic scholarship, my father said, "Well, at least your tuition will be manageable." He said it kindly. He meant it kindly. But I was 17 years old, and I understood exactly what that sentence communicated about where I ranked in the family's investment portfolio. I went to Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro. I lived in a dormitory that smelled like industrial cleaning product and dining hall food, and the particular combination of ambition and uncertainty that every college dormitory in every state smelled like. I worked 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore to cover my living expenses, and I studied at night, and I found, in the business program's coursework, the first formal language for the thing I had always been able to do, which was see how systems worked, and where the value was being created and where it was being missed. My first professor, who actually saw this, was a woman named Dr. Patricia Lawson, who taught Introduction to Real Estate Markets in my sophomore year. Not because it was a glamorous course, because she walked into that classroom on day one and said, "Most people look at a property and see a building. The people who make money in this business look at a property and see time. They see what it was worth, what it is worth now, what it will be worth when the market moves the way markets always move eventually." She paused and looked at the class. "The hard part is having the patience to wait for eventually." I wrote that down. I kept the notebook. I still have it. Dr. Lawson became the first adult outside my family who treated my way of thinking as an asset rather than a quirk. She let me stay after class and ask questions that went past what the syllabus covered. She pointed me toward books and case studies and real transactions she had been involved in during her career before teaching. In my junior year, she connected me with an internship at a small property investment firm in Nashville called Bridgepoint Capital that was run by a man named Owen Hayes, who was 62 years old and had been making careful, unsexy, long-term real estate investments in Middle Tennessee since 1987, and who was, by any honest accounting, significantly wealthier than anyone would have guessed from looking at his office or his car or the way he dressed. Owen Hayes was the second adult outside my family who changed the direction of my life. He hired me as an intern for one summer. By the end of the summer, he had offered me a part-time position during my senior year. When I graduated, he offered me a full-time analyst role at a salary that was modest, but real, and that came with something more valuable than the salary, which was access to 27 years of how Owen Hayes thought about property. I took it without calling my parents first. When I told my father I was going to work for a small investment firm in Nashville rather than pursuing the corporate marketing track he had assumed I was building toward, he said, "Rachel, a small firm. Will this go anywhere?" I said, "I think so, Dad." He said, "Your sister has a job offer from a hospitality group in Nashville. Did I tell you that?" He had not told me that. He told me then, for 20 minutes. That was the last conversation I had with my father about my career for almost 2 years. Owen Hayes ran Bridgepoint Capital from a third-floor office in a building in East Nashville that he owned outright and that he had purchased in 2003 when East Nashville was not what it became, and when the price per square foot reflected the neighborhood's reputation rather than its potential. By the time I started working for him, that building was worth 4 times what he had paid for it, and he had never once mentioned this to anyone who hadn't specifically asked, because Owen Hayes had the specific quality of wealthy people who had built real money through patience rather than performance, which was that he had no interest in impressing anyone. He was a small, compact man with reading glasses he kept on top of his head, and a habit of doing calculations on paper rather than a calculator, because he said the physical act of writing numbers down made him process them more accurately. He drank black coffee from a thermos he brought from home every morning, and he ate lunch at the same diner 2 blocks away every single weekday, and had been doing both things for so long that they had stopped being habits and had become simply the structure of his days. He taught me things that no classroom had taught me. The first thing he taught me was the difference between a transaction and a position. A transaction was buying and selling for immediate gain. A position was acquiring something you understood deeply and holding it while time and the market did the work that time and markets inevitably did. He said most people in real estate operated in transactions because transactions felt active and positions felt passive, and most people confused activity with progress. The second thing he taught me was how to read a market's underlying story rather than its surface numbers. Any market had a surface story: what prices were doing right now, what volume looked like, what the headlines said. Underneath the surface story, there was always a deeper story about population movement and infrastructure investment and employment patterns, and the specific way that cities grew, and which direction they grew, and what that meant for land values 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. The people who read the surface story bought and sold in the present. The people who read the deeper story bought in the present and collected in the future. The third thing he taught me, and this was the one that took me the longest to fully absorb, was that the most important resource in property investment was not capital. It was patience backed by conviction. Capital without conviction scattered. Conviction without patience burned out. Patience without conviction was just waiting. What produced results was all three things together, working in a direction you had analyzed thoroughly enough to hold even when the short-term picture looked uncertain. I worked for Owen for 4 years. In those 4 years, I watched him acquire 3 properties in Nashville neighborhoods that the market had not yet noticed in the way it would eventually notice them. I watched him hold 2 properties through a period when the market softened and other investors sold. I watched him negotiate with the specific calm of someone who understood that desperation was the most expensive thing a buyer or seller could bring to a table, and who had structured his financial life specifically to never be desperate. And I saved. I had been saving since my first paycheck at the campus bookstore in Murfreesboro. The amount was embarrassingly small at first. The discipline was the point. Owen had told me in my second year at Bridgepoint, the size of the savings matters less than the consistency of the habit. You're building a muscle. The muscle matters more than the weight you're lifting right now. So I saved every month regardless of the amount, and I put it in an account I did not touch, and I let it accumulate the way things accumulated when you left them alone and kept adding to them. I also, during those 4 years, became what Owen called a student of a specific market. My specific market was a corridor of Nashville that included the Gulch neighborhood and the areas immediately surrounding it. A stretch of the city that had been industrial and transitional, and then had begun its transformation into one of the most desirable urban living areas in Tennessee, with the specific momentum of a neighborhood that had hit the tipping point between emerging and arrived. I had been watching it since my junior year of college when Dr. Lawson had used it as a case study in her advanced real estate course. I had been tracking it through my years at Bridgepoint. I knew the property values block by block. I knew which buildings had changed hands recently and for what prices. I knew the rental rates and the occupancy rates and the tenant profiles and the development pipeline and the infrastructure investments the city had made and was planning to make. I knew this corridor the way Owen had taught me to know a market, which was from the inside out rather than the outside in. My parents did not know any of this. My parents knew that I worked for a small investment firm in East Nashville and that I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Germantown that I rented for $950 a month, and that I drove a 2014 Honda Civic that I had bought used and maintained carefully. My father had visited my apartment once, briefly, when he was in the neighborhood for a client lunch, and had looked around with the expression of a man who was not going to say what he was thinking, and then had said, "It's cozy, Rachel," which communicated everything he was not saying. My sister Vanessa, during those same 4 years, had moved into the penthouse apartment in the Gulch building that my parents were paying for, and had spent those years working in event coordination for a hospitality group, which was a job she was genuinely good at because it suited every skill she had, and which she performed from an address that cost $4,800 per month in rent that appeared on my parents' credit card statement. I knew the building. Of course I knew the building. I had been tracking every significant property in that corridor for 3 years. I knew what the building had sold for when it changed hands 18 months earlier. I knew who the new ownership group was. I knew what their acquisition strategy looked like based on the other properties in their portfolio. I knew that they were assembling a specific type of asset collection and that the buildings they held tended to be repositioned within 2 to 3 years of acquisition. I knew all of this and said nothing. At Christmas that year, my father gave Vanessa a piece of jewelry from a store on West End Avenue that I knew cost between $3,000 and $4,000 because I had walked past the window enough times to have a sense of the price range. He gave me a Visa gift card for $250 with a bow on it. My mother said, "Rachel, we weren't sure what you needed." I said, "This is great, thank you." Vanessa said, "Ratch, I love your top." I said, "Thanks." We had dinner and my father told a story about a deal he was working on, and Vanessa talked about an event she had organized for a celebrity client. And I ate my food and listened and thought about a corridor of Nashville real, a state that nobody at the table was thinking about. The Visa gift card had a decorative Christmas tree on it. I spent $240 of it on a property analysis software subscription that Owen had recommended. The remaining $10 I put in my savings account. Owen Hayes had a health scare in the spring of my 4th year at Bridgepoint. He did not call it a health scare. He called it a situation the cardiologist is managing with the specific dismissiveness of a man who had spent 66 years treating his body as a vehicle for his mind and was mildly irritated that the vehicle was now occasionally sending warning lights. He was fine, ultimately. The situation was managed, but it changed the texture of our working relationship in a way that I think changed the direction of both of our futures. He started talking differently after the cardiologist visit. Not about mortality. Owen was too practical for that conversation. He started talking about what happened to the Bridgepoint portfolio if something happened to him. He had a daughter in Portland who had her own career and had never expressed any interest in property investment. He had no business partner. He had built Bridgepoint as a one-person operation supported by a small team of analysts, which had been efficient and had worked perfectly for 27 years, and which became a clear structural vulnerability the moment you considered what happened to it without him. He asked me one afternoon, over terrible diner coffee 2 blocks from the office, whether I had ever thought about having my own portfolio rather than managing someone else's. I told him the truth. I said I had been thinking about it since my 3rd month working for him, and that I had been building toward it in the specific way he had taught me to build toward things, which was slowly, carefully, and with more preparation than most people thought was necessary. He looked at me over his reading glasses, which were on his face rather than his head for once, which meant he was paying specific attention. He said, "What's your market?" I told him. I described the Gulch corridor. I described the 3 years of tracking I had done. I described the specific property I had identified as the right first acquisition, a mixed-use building on a street 3 blocks from the main activity of the Gulch, currently undervalued relative to the direction the market was moving, with a commercial ground floor and 8 residential units above it, owned by an estate that was slowly recognizing it needed to liquidate assets. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "What's your capital position?" I told him. He was quiet again. He said, "You need more." I said, "I know, I'm working on it." He said, "How long to get there?" I said, 14 months if the market holds." He said, "The market will hold. That corridor is in the middle of a move that has 3 to 5 years left." He drank his coffee. 14 months is fine." He said, "When you're ready, come to me before you go to a bank." I said, "Owen." He said, "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a business relationship. You bring the analysis, I bring part of the capital, we structure a partnership agreement that's fair to both of us. I've been looking for a way to deploy some capital in that corridor for 2 years, and I haven't had the right vehicle. Your acquisition might be the right vehicle." He said, "Think about it." I thought about it for approximately 4 hours, and then I came back to the office and told him yes. That conversation happened in March. By May, the estate sale on the mixed-use building had been formally listed. By June, Owen and I had signed a partnership agreement, and I had submitted an offer. By August, we had closed. I was 29 years old. I owned, in partnership with Owen Hayes, a mixed-use building 3 blocks from the main Gulch activity in Nashville, Tennessee, with 8 residential units and a commercial ground floor, and the specific feeling of that closing, the moment when the deed transferred and the keys were in my hand, was something I did not share with anyone in my family because I was not ready for the conversation that sharing it would create. I was not hiding it from them. I was protecting the building from their opinions before the building had time to prove itself. There is a difference between those 2 things, and it took me years to understand it clearly. The building needed work. The previous owner had deferred maintenance in the way that estate-managed properties often deferred maintenance, which was by doing the minimum required to keep tenants in place and ignoring the structural improvements that would have increased the building's value. Owen and I had priced this into the acquisition. We had a renovation plan and a contractor, and a timeline that was aggressive enough to get the units back on the market at updated rents, without being so aggressive that it became chaotic. I managed the renovation myself, not with a hammer in my hand. I was not a contractor, with a schedule and a daily walkthrough and the specific intense attention of someone who was managing their own money for the first time rather than someone else's. I learned things about construction timelines and contractor relationships and material supply chains that no classroom had ever come close to teaching me. I made mistakes. I fixed them. I stayed inside the budget Owen and I had set, and I finished 3 weeks later than planned, which Owen said was remarkably close to on time for a first renovation project. The units were re-rented within 6 weeks. The commercial space took longer, 4 months to find the right tenant, a small independent coffee roaster who wanted a Gulch area presence and who signed a 3-year lease at a rate that more than covered our debt service on that portion of the building. The building was performing. I moved into my analysis of the next acquisition. And meanwhile, in the family's version of the universe, I was still Rachel, who worked for a small firm and lived in the Germantown apartment and drove the Honda Civic and showed up at Christmas for the Visa gift card with the Christmas tree. My father had mentioned at Thanksgiving that year that Vanessa's hospitality career was really taking off. He said a client of hers had specifically requested her for a private event. He said her boss had told him she was one of the best event coordinators they had. He said this to the table in the specific way that parents announced their children's professional developments as if they were reading from a press release. I said, "That's great, good for her." He said, "What's new with you, Rachel?" I said, "Things are good at work." He said, "Bridgepoint's still treating you well." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's good. Stability is important." He turned back to his food. That was the Thanksgiving conversation. Stability. 2 years later, I owned 4 properties. I had left Bridgepoint on good terms with Owen, who had become a genuine business partner and whose health had stabilized, and who had started to describe Bridgepoint's future in terms that involved my involvement in ways that went beyond the partnership on my first building. I had a real estate holding company registered in Tennessee under the name Torres Capital Group, which I had named without any particular drama because the name was accurate and clean and easy to say. The name on the company paperwork was mine and mine alone. Nobody in my family knew about Torres Capital Group. Nobody knew about the 4 properties. Nobody knew that the building in which my sister lived in a penthouse that cost $4,800 a month was on my radar in a very specific way. I had known for 8 months that the ownership group that held that building was looking to sell. I had known for 6 months that the price range they were considering was within what Torres Capital Group could reach with the right structure. I had known for 3 months that Owen was interested in co-investing. And I had known for 2 months that the acquisition was going to happen. I had just not told anyone. The acquisition of the Gulch building closed on a Thursday morning in October. I was in Howard Barnett's. I was in the title company's conference room in Nashville with my attorney, a woman named Caroline Marsh, who I had been working with for 2 years on Torres Capital Group's acquisitions, and Owen's representative, and the seller's team. And the specific organized machinery of a commercial real estate closing that involved a significant amount of paper and a significant amount of signatures, and the specific focused attention of everyone in the room on making sure every line was correct. I signed my name many times that morning. The last signature was on the deed transfer. After that final signature, the building was mine. Ours, Torres Capital Group with Owen as a minority partner, the same structure we had used on the first building and refined across the 3 that followed. But mine in the operational sense, mine in the decision-making sense, mine in the sense that every letter going forward from building management to tenants would originate from my company, including notices. Caroline had walked me through the tenant situation during due diligence. The building had 12 residential units. 10 of them were rented at market rate to tenants who had signed standard lease agreements and whose leases would transfer normally to the new ownership. 2 units were in a different situation. One unit on the 7th floor had a tenant who was significantly below market rate on a month-to-month arrangement that the previous ownership had allowed to persist for personal reasons that the file did not fully document. Caroline said we had the right to issue proper notice and transition that unit to market rate. The penthouse unit, the top floor, the $4,800 a month unit, was also month-to-month. The previous owners had allowed it to roll over without a renewed lease for 14 months. The tenant of record was listed as Sandra Torres of Brentwood, Tennessee, which was my mother's name and my family's Brentwood address, which meant my mother was technically the tenant, and the rent was being paid from my parents' account. Caroline had looked at me when she showed me this during due diligence. She said, "You know this tenant?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to discuss how you'd like to handle this unit?" I had thought about it. I want to be honest here, I had thought about it more than I thought about any other aspect of this acquisition. Not because I was constructing a revenge plan, because the situation was genuinely complicated and I needed to be clear about what I actually wanted before I made any decision. What I wanted was not to hurt my sister. Vanessa had not done anything to me directly. She had been the beneficiary of a family dynamic that I had been the casualty of, but those two things were not the same as her having caused the dynamic intentionally. What I wanted was to run my building correctly. The penthouse unit at below market rate on a month-to-month arrangement with a tenant whose actual occupant was a third party not named in the lease was not a correct situation from a property management perspective. It was the kind of arrangement that prior ownership had allowed out of personal relationships, and that new ownership had every professional reason to address. What I also wanted, and I might as well say this clearly because this story deserves honesty, was for my family to understand in a specific and undeniable way that the child they had written off had been paying attention. I told Caroline to prepare standard notice for the penthouse unit. A 24-hour notice to vacate, consistent with the month-to-month arrangement, professionally drafted, legally sound, delivered through proper channels. I told her to time the delivery for the Saturday of Vanessa's graduation party. Caroline had said, "You know about the graduation party?" I said, "My mother mentioned it." She said, "You're not planning to attend." I said, "I was not invited." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "This is legal and appropriate from a property management standpoint." I said, "I know." She said, "I want to make sure you've thought through the family dynamics." I said, "I have thought about nothing else for 3 months." She said, "Okay, I'll prepare the notice." The man she hired to deliver it was a process server named Gerald who dressed in plain clothes the way process servers did when they wanted to move through a crowd without drawing attention before the delivery was made. Caroline had briefed him on the location and timing. He had confirmed receipt. I was in my Germantown apartment on that Saturday afternoon. I was not watching a live stream. I was not tracking anything on my phone. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a property analysis I had been working on for a new potential acquisition in a different Nashville corridor. The analysis needed to be finished by Monday. My phone rang at 4:23 p.m. It was my mother. I answered. She said, "Rachel." Her voice had the specific quality of a person who was simultaneously furious and uncertain, and was not sure which one to lead with. I said, "Hi, Mom." She said, "Someone came to Vanessa's party." I said, "Okay." She said, "He gave her an envelope." I said, "Okay." She said, "Rachel, it was a notice to vacate her apartment, a legal notice. It has a company name on it, Torres Capital Group." She paused, a pause that had the weight of someone whose mind was assembling information it was not prepared for. "Rachel, that's your name." I said, "Yes." She said, "You own her building." I said, "I acquired it last Thursday." The silence on my mother's end lasted long enough that I counted to 11 before she spoke again. She said, "How?" I said, "I've been building a real estate portfolio for 4 years, Mom. Torres Capital Group has 5 properties in Nashville." She said, 5. I said, yes. She said, Rachel, why didn't you? She stopped. Your father is going to want to talk to you. I said, I'm sure he is. She said, Vanessa is very upset. I said, I understand. She said, did you do this on purpose, on her graduation day? I said, the notice was issued in the standard course of transitioning tenant arrangements after an acquisition. The timing was professional. She knew that wasn't the whole answer. My mother was not a foolish woman. She knew what professional meant when her daughter said it in that specific tone on that specific day. She said, Rachel. I said, yes. She said, your father is asking for the phone. My father's voice came on a moment later. Marco Torres, the commercial real estate broker, the man who had spent 20 years adjacent to the kind of wealth he wanted, and who had handed his quiet daughter a Christmas tree Visa gift card while his social daughter received jewelry and a penthouse. He said, Rachel. I said, hi, Dad. He said, you own the building Vanessa lives in. I said, yes. He said, you issued her a vacate notice on her graduation day. I said, the unit is month to month. The lease is in Mom's name. The arrangement was below market rate and was not structured for new ownership transfer. He said, you could have called me. You could have told me you were acquiring this building and we could have worked something out. I said, Dad, I called you in August of last year to tell you I was thinking about making my first property investment. You said, Rachel, are you sure that's the right move for someone at your level? Real estate takes capital. Then you asked me to put Vanessa on because she wanted to tell you about a rooftop event she was planning. He was quiet. I said, I have been building for 4 years. I have 5 properties. I manage them professionally and I make professional decisions about them. He said, you're punishing your sister. I said, I am managing a building I acquired last Thursday according to standard property management practice. He said, Rachel, this is not. I said, Dad, when is the last time you asked me what I was working on and actually listened to the answer? He did not respond immediately. I said, Vanessa has 30 days. The notice says 24 hours, but that is the legal minimum. I am prepared to offer 30 days as a professional courtesy given the circumstances. He said, 30 days. I said, yes. He said, she lives there. I said, I know. He said, where is she supposed to go? I said, that's a conversation you and Mom and Vanessa need to have. I'll have Caroline reach out to discuss the formal transition. He said, who is Caroline? I said, my attorney. He said my attorney the way a man repeated words when his mind was trying to catch up to the situation those words described. He said, Rachel, I want to understand something. I said, okay. He said, how long have you been doing this? I said, 4 years of building, 7 years of learning before that. He said, 7, he stopped. He said, you've been building this for 7 years. I said, yes. He said, and you never said anything. I said things, you were listening for different things. That sentence landed in the specific way that true sentences landed when they were also hard to hear. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had a quality in it that I had not heard from him in a very long time, which was something close to uncertainty. Not quite humility. The approach of humility in a man for whom humility had always been uncomfortable. He said, I didn't know. I said, I know. He said, I should have. I said, Dad, I need to get back to work. I have an analysis to finish. He said, we should talk. I said, we will, but not tonight. Vanessa called me the next morning. Early 7:42, which was early for Vanessa, which told me she had either not slept or had been thinking about calling since the previous afternoon and had waited until she thought was an acceptable hour. I was already at my kitchen table with coffee. I was always at my kitchen table with coffee by 7. I answered. She said, hey. I said, hey. She said, I need to understand what happened yesterday. I said, you got a notice to vacate from Torres Capital Group, which is the new owner of your building. She said, which is you? I said, yes. She said, Rachel, she exhaled. I'm not going to pretend I'm not blindsided. I'm completely blindsided. I said, I know. She said, did you plan this for graduation day specifically? I told her the truth. I said, the timing was deliberate. I'm not going to lie to you about that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why? I said, because for 11 years, every family gathering has been a celebration of you that happened to include me in the background. Your graduations, your job announcements, your promotions, the rooftop event stories, mom's jewelry gifts versus my Visa gift cards. I have been building something real for 4 years, and nobody in this family has asked about it once because they assumed there was nothing real to ask about. She said, Rachel. I said, I am not blaming you for that. I want to be clear. You did not create the dynamic. You were just in the position the dynamic created for you. She said, but you used me to send a message to them. I said, yes. She said, that wasn't fair to me. I held the phone. I thought about that. I said, you're right. It wasn't completely fair to you. I'm sorry for that specific part. She was quiet. She said, what happens now with the apartment? I said, you have 30 days. After that, the unit goes to market rate if you want to stay, or it goes back on the market if you don't. Market rate for that unit right now is $6,200 a month. She said, I can't afford that. I said, I know. She said, Mom and Dad won't. She stopped. I said, Vanessa, I think this might be a good moment to not have them pay for your apartment. She said, easy for you to say. I said, I know it is. I have been figuring out how to not need things paid for since I was 19 years old in a dormitory in Murfreesboro, working 20 hours a week. She said, that's not fair, I didn't choose. I said, I know, you didn't choose the dynamic either, but you've been inside it and it's worth thinking about what that has cost you separately from what it cost me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, do you actually have 5 properties? I said, 5, I'm looking at a 6th. She said, in Nashville. I said, 4 in Nashville, 1 in Murfreesboro. She said, how? I told her, not the whole history, we didn't have the relationship yet for the whole history, but the outline. Owen Hayes, Dr. Lawson, the first acquisition, the framework of building a position slowly rather than making one big move. She listened. She was a good listener when she was genuinely trying to listen rather than managing a room. I had forgotten that about her, or maybe I had never fully known it because we had not had a real conversation in years. She said, Dad doesn't know about any of this. I said, he knows now. She said, she paused, he's going to be complicated about this. I said, I know. She said, he's proud of you. I said, he doesn't need to be proud of me. I didn't build this for him to be proud of. She said, what did you build it for? I thought about that. I thought about Owen Hayes and Dr. Lawson and the campus bookstore in Murfreesboro, and the notebook from the first real estate class I had taken, and the Christmas tree Visa card, and the 4 years of building in silence while my family looked the other way. I said, I built it because I saw how the system worked, and I understood what patience could do, and I wanted to have something that was completely mine. Something nobody could take credit for, and nobody could minimize, and nobody could overlook. She said, you built it to be undeniable. I said, yes. She said, it worked. I said, I know. She found an apartment in East Nashville within 2 weeks, not a penthouse. A clean, well-managed 1-bedroom in a building I did not own, at a rent she could cover herself from her salary. She told me about it in a text message that said, found a place. It's mine. Feels weird but good. I texted back, that's the feeling. Hold on to it. My father called me 5 days after the graduation party, when the initial heat had cooled enough for him to have a conversation rather than a reaction. He said, "Rachel, I want to apologize." I said, "Okay." He said, "I have been watching you the wrong way for a long time. I was looking for the things I understood, the right school, the right firm, the visible track. You were building something I didn't know how to see, and I wrote it off as not enough instead of asking what it actually was." He said, "I am sorry for that." He said it like he meant it, not perfectly. He was not a man who apologized easily, and the words were slightly stiff with the effort it cost him. But he meant it. I could hear that he meant it. I said, "I appreciate that, Dad." He said, 5 properties. I said, "Working on 6. He said, "The Gulch building. What are you planning for the Penthouse?" I said, $6,200 a month. I have 3 qualified applications already." He was quiet. Then he said, "You priced it correctly." I said, "I know the market." He said, "You've always known the market." I said, "You taught me some of that. The way you talked about properties and how neighborhoods moved. I listened more than you thought." He was quiet again. I let him be quiet. Then he said, "I want to have dinner, just us. Can we do that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I want to hear about what you've built, all of it." I said, "I'd like that." We had dinner 2 weeks later at a restaurant on West End Avenue, which was his choice. And he asked me every question he should have been asking for 4 years. And I answered all of them, and the dinner lasted 3 hours. And when we left, he shook my hand in the parking lot like he did with people he respected professionally. And I understood that the handshake was also an apology, and also a form of the pride he had never known how to give me, and I accepted all 3 things simultaneously. The Penthouse was leased 6 days later. Torres Capital Group was under letter of intent on the 6th property. And my name was at the bottom of the notice that had changed the direction of our family. Nashville in November is the specific color of a city that has decided to be honest about the season. The trees in Germantown go orange, and then brown, and then bare, and the light gets that low-angle afternoon quality that makes everything look slightly more serious than it did in summer. I have been here long enough now that the seasons feel like mine. The city feels like mine. Not owned, I know better than to think you own a city. Just mine in the way that a place became yours when you had built something real inside it. Owen Hayes had a medical checkup in October that came back clean. He called me to tell me and said, "Another year of terrible diner coffee." And I said, "I'll see you there Tuesday." He laughed. We have lunch there every Tuesday still. He orders the same thing, and I order what looks good, and we talk about markets and positions and the specific patience that turns small decisions made correctly over time into things that matter. He told me once, about 6 months after the Gulch acquisition, that the best thing about watching me work was that I never confused activity with progress. I said he had taught me that. He said, "I told you the concept. You understood why it was true. Those are different things." He drank his coffee. Most people never understand why. They just memorize the rule. Vanessa and I have dinner now. Not every week. We are still building something between us that was never built before. The specific relationship of 2 sisters who went through a decade of parallel lives in the same family and are now figuring out what they actually have in common without the family's narrative organizing it for them. She is good company when the performance is off. She is funny and perceptive, and she sees people with an accuracy that I had never fully appreciated, because I was usually at the edge of the room while she was working the center of it. She told me at one of those dinners that she had started a savings account, a real one. She said, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I figured starting was better than not starting." I told her about the muscle, about how the size mattered less than the consistency. She said, "You sound like someone's wise mentor." I said, "I had a good one." She said, "So did I eventually." She was looking at me when she said it. My parents are a work in progress. My father has been a work in progress since that parking lot handshake, and the progress is real even when it is slow. He asked me last month whether I would be willing to look at a property he was considering recommending to a client and whether I had any thoughts on the corridor it was in. I looked at the address. I had tracked that block for 2 years. I gave him 3 pages of analysis. He read all of it and called me to talk through the specifics, and the conversation lasted 90 minutes, and was the best professional conversation we had ever had, and possibly one of the best conversations of any kind. My mother is my mother. She is warm and strategic, and she loves me genuinely, and she is slowly, in the way that some people slowly adjusted to information that required them to reconsider their picture of a person they thought they knew, adjusting to the picture of me that the Gulch acquisition made impossible to avoid seeing. She sent me a text last Christmas that said, "Rachel, I want you to know I think about that building every day, and I am so proud of you." It was the first time she had ever sent me something like that without occasion, without a graduation or an announcement or a formal reason. Just a Tuesday in December and a text that said she was proud of me. I saved it. It is still in my phone. Here is the thing about building something in silence that I want to say before this story ends. People will tell you that silence is strategic, that you should stay quiet so you can surprise people later and watch their faces change when they finally understand what you have been doing. And there is truth in that. I am not going to pretend the graduation party afternoon was not satisfying in a real human way, because it was. But silence is not primarily a strategy. Silence is what building requires. You cannot build and perform simultaneously. You cannot grow something real and spend your energy convincing people it is real at the same time. The silence is not about the reveal at the end. The silence is about having enough space and enough focus to actually construct something worth revealing. The people who dismissed you did not create your success. Your work created your success. Their dismissal just created the silence in which the work could happen without interruption. That is what I want you to take from this story. The ones who did not believe in you are not the villains of your story. They are the people whose attention was on a different channel. And while their attention was somewhere else, you had the gift of being able to build without an audience. Build without an audience. Because when the building is real and complete and legal and documented and earning income, it does not need you to announce it. The envelope does that. If this story gave you something today, if any part of it was the thing you needed to hear, please hit that like button. Leave a comment and tell me what you thought of Rachel's decision. Was the timing right? Would you have done something different? I read every comment and I want to know what you think. Subscribe to this channel if you are not already here. Every story we tell is this honest and this deep. We are not interested in easy. We are interested in real. Ring the notification bell and be here for the next one. Take care of yourselves out there. See you next time.